This week, we're coming up to the most important thing. What God said to Job. You see, we've looked a lot about what we say to each other when we're suffering, but the really, really interesting, the really, really shocking thing about the book of Job is what God actually says to Job. So what did God say? What did God do? Well, let's take one step back. What do we think God might do? If we were in Job's position, what might we expect God to say? What might we want God to say to us if we're in a position of suffering? Maybe you have got a problem in your life at the moment. Maybe you're suffering with something and you've got an idea about the sorts of things you would like God to say to you. We might say, God, give me a reason this is happening. I want to know why this is happening to me. We might say, God, will you explain your plan? What's going to happen next? How does this fit? We might want some instructions. Okay, God, what should I do? What should I do about this situation that I'm in? Those are the sorts of things that when I'm suffering, I want God to tell me. I want God to show up and explain this stuff to me. That's what I want. But the big question is, what did God actually say? And what God actually says is a bunch of questions. He asks things like, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? When you make a world, how do you actually lay the foundations? Do you know where the gates of death are? And a whole host of other questions that Job could not possibly comprehend. He just doesn't understand it. Now, some clever scientific types look at some of those questions now and say, well, we know the answers to some of these things. He asks Job, do you know where the stores are, where the hail is kept, ready to come out of the sky? And we as scientists would say, well, you know, we know that there is no storehouse for hail and it's created by meteorological conditions and stuff like that. Yet the point is its context. If this was happening today, God would be asking us if we understand quantum physics or unified theory of all the forces. Do you know what I mean? He's just laying out a load of questions where Job's going, duh, what? And Job doesn't have a clue. Now, isn't that interesting? What we want is answers. What God gave him was questions. So God gives no answers. He gave no explanations. He gave no solutions. All the things that you want, God didn't even give a hint of them. He just asked a bunch of questions. We want the plan. God did not reveal his plan to Job. But what he did do is this. He just revealed himself. That was the key. Job wanted answers, but then he got God. And when he had God, the answers didn't matter. Just having that connection with God, that was enough for Job. His questions remained, but he had connection with God. His frustrations and anger remained, but now he had connection with God. And that was enough. It's interesting that part of the story of Job happens in heaven. You know, we read the first chapter or so where it says the supernatural beings appeared before God, and God says to the enemy, have you seen Job? And they have a conversation. Satan and Job have a conversation, and Satan and God, not Satan and Job. Satan and God have a conversation. And then the suffering begins, and then Satan and God have another conversation, and more suffering comes. We are let into that part of the story at some point. Now, we don't know when God explained that bit of the story. At some point, God wanted the story of Job written down, and whoever was writing it, God gave them that information. Maybe it was Job later on in his life. We don't know. We don't know who actually wrote down this thing. But I tell you what, during the book of Job, Job is never told that actually there's been a confrontation in heaven. He never finds that out. In the whole of the story that we're revealed to us, that's not part of what he finds out. part of the reason for this whole episode happening is so that God would reveal things about suffering. Because God knows that suffering is one of those questions we ask about. And God knows he wants to put something in the Word, in the Bible, so that we get some answers to our frustrations about evil and suffering. That's partly why this whole thing happened. We have that explanation I was talking about last week, that God sees an opportunity to free Job from the thing that had terrified him his whole life. His whole life he was worried about what might happen if Satan could get hold of him, if things went wrong in his life. He lived his whole life terrified about that. And God saw an opportunity to free him from that by letting something bad happen to him and then making it turn out all right in the end. And by that, Job gets released from a lifelong fear. Now, maybe Job thought that's what it was all about. But you know what? God saw far more than that. God didn't just say, this is a chance for Job to be released from his fear and to understand his problem of self-righteousness. God said, I can use this to teach people into the future. I can use this and get it written down so in the future people read my word and understand that this is having an impact into the future. We know that now. Job was never told that's what it was about. Because actually, what happened to Job has affected billions of people. Billions of people can learn through the story of Job. Now, I imagine if I were Job and I were going through some suffering and I were to discover that my suffering was going to teach billions of people, I might feel a bit better about it. You might think, oh, well, that's fair enough then. You know, I don't enjoy the suffering, but if billions of people are going to be helped, I feel much better about that. But Job was never told about that. Of course, he's in heaven now, so he knows now. But during his lifetime, he never knew that. It is almost a shock to me how little God told him. But Job connected with God, and that was all that mattered to him. Sometimes when I'm preaching, I get to a point and I say, you can forget everything else if necessary. Just remember this. If there's only one thing I want you to remember from everything I say today, it is this: that when we connect with God, that is all that matters. It transcends, it goes beyond anything that we're going through. And that's why connection with God is so important. And that's why the word connection is written on the wall in big letters up high above everything else. Because it all comes from connection with God. So, God promises no answers in the midst of suffering. And if you come to me at any point and say, I'm going through this problem and I'm going through this suffering and I don't know why, do you know why this is happening to me? I can give you no answer. I don't know. It's not really the way that this whole subject works. We do not get the answers very often. Sometimes you might get something, we'll come to that in a minute. But generally speaking, there is no promise that this side of heaven you will get an answer for anything that you have suffered in this life. So, why not? That's a sensible question, isn't it? If God doesn't give us answers, why not? Well, I don't know, but I've got two ideas. So let me tell you about the ideas I have. First one is this. Maybe it wouldn't help if you knew why you were suffering. Maybe it wouldn't help if you knew why it was hurting. Because let's face it, if you know the source of your pain, you're still in pain. This idea that if I knew the source of my pain, it wouldn't hurt anymore, well, that's not true, right? When I've got toothache, I know why I've got toothache. It's because I've got bad tooth. Knowing I've got a bad tooth does not do anything to remove the pain of my bad tooth, yeah? So maybe our focus on I want to know why, when you think about it, is really not the point. Because knowing doesn't remove the pain. Now it's interesting, the book of Lamentations is written by the prophet Jeremiah after national tragedy, after things have gone absolutely pear-shaped, horrendous, awful, exile, death. And it happened because the nation had sinned. It happened because they ignored God. They knew exactly why the suffering had come upon them, and it turns out it was their own fault. Do you think that helped? Do you think if you're suffering because you've made bad decisions, bad choices, do you think that helps? I would argue you feel worse. Actually, it's bad enough when you're suffering, but when you know you brought it on yourself and you could have avoided it if you'd made some better decisions, that doesn't make me feel better. That makes me feel worse. So maybe sometimes it's better not to know exactly why we're suffering. That's one thought. Second thought is this. Maybe the whole suffering thing is not about the solution to the suffering thing. Maybe it's not about a quick resolution to the problem. Maybe it's about drawing us to God. Because if you look at the book of Job, what this fundamentally is about Job getting close to God. It wasn't about getting answers, it was about getting a deeper relationship. And maybe that's what God wants to achieve when we go through a time of suffering. Because when you have a problem, if you're anything like me, you pray more. It's funny how when you have no problem, we sometimes forget to pray. But when you have a problem, the problem reminds you to pray. The problem reminds you to connect with God. It might lead you to meditate on what is happening. Meditate on what you know of God. It might lead you to study the Word. Actually, when we go through a problem, that can be the time we get drawn to God more than any other. In Matthew 7, verse 7 and 8, it says this: keep on asking and you will receive what you ask for. Out of interest, many translations have this thing about ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. The New Living Translation and some others don't just say ask, they say keep on asking. The Greek verbs are written in what's called the active voice. So it's not just ask once and you will receive, seek once and you will find. It's this active. If you are active in your asking, active in your seeking, active in your knocking, then you will receive what you ask for. You will find. The door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, to everyone who knocks the door will be opened. It is in the time of suffering that I find myself asking and seeking and knocking and finding myself drawing closer to God. Now some people go the other way. Some people say, oh, I don't like this. There can't be a God, and they go the other way. It's our choice whether the suffering brings us closer or further from God. A maths book. Sorry if I've just triggered any nightmares in anybody and seeing a maths textbook. I used to be a school teacher. I taught maths and science, mostly. And often, back in the day, because it was quite a while ago, we had textbooks. Like nowadays it's all online or worksheets, isn't it? But back in the day we had textbooks. And very often there are questions in the book, and where are the answers? They're in the back of the book. Okay? And the idea of having the answers in the back of the book is so that when you work out your answer and you're thinking, am I correct or not? You look in the back of the book and it's like, yes, I'm right, great, fantastic. Or, no, I'm wrong. Oh, all right, I need to go back and think again. That's the reason the answers are in the back. Now, when I'm talking to students, it can be very hard for them to grasp this. So like, there's the question, and they think, well, here's the question. The purpose of this is for me to give the teacher the answer. And the easiest way for me to give the teacher the answer is for me to look in the back of the book, write down the answer, and then I've achieved the purpose, haven't I? So when my homework is, do these 20 questions, It's simple. The purpose is to provide answers to 20 questions. I go to the back of the book, I write down 20 answers to those questions, which I know are completely correct, and I hand in my homework, and I expect to get top marks. And of course they get nothing because they didn't show they're working. But here's the thing, I have to explain. You probably understand it. The purpose of that exercise is not to get the answer. The purpose is to wrestle with the problem. The purpose is to think about the problem. The purpose is to recognize which bits of this problem do you understand and which bits of this problem do you not get. It is a fact that your brain is transformed by the thinking about the problem. And if you do that homework and you think about it, you get to the end of the homework and you have been changed. And whether you got the answers right or wrong is not really the point. If you got the answers wrong, you've learned something by your mistake. If you got the answers right, you have your strategy confirmed. But you've learned something regardless, because you engage in the wrestling with the problem. And I think that God allows us to have that suffering and doesn't just give you an instant answer, because in our wrestling with the problem, in our engaging with God, that actually transforms us. Would I rather just be able to look at the answer in the back? Yes, but we all know that doesn't work. That doesn't change us at all, because that's not the point. And maybe that's why God doesn't explain. Now, in this process, Job got angry, Job questioned, Job complained, Job was frustrated, Job said some very, very rash things to God. How do you think God felt about that when he's getting moaned at, argued at, complained at, accused, told he's not fair? How does God feel about that? God's okay with that. God did not have any problem with that at all. At the end of the book of Job, in that last chapter, he talks to God talks to the three friends. You remember last week we were talking about why what the three friends were saying was nonsense. And God says to the three friends, you were rubbish. Your misunderstanding is so bad, you need to make a sacrifice for sin and ask Job to pray for you. But Job is okay in what he said. Think about that. Job is angry, frustrated, questioning, moaning at God. And God says, Job's fine. I didn't have any problem with that. It is fine to vent at God. It is fine to moan at God. It is fine to say, God, I do not understand why this is happening to me. I do not understand why you could allow this. Why has nothing changed? God doesn't mind you asking stuff like that. In fact, in lots of verses in the Bible, he shows us that that's a good thing to do. In Psalm 13, verse 1 and 2. Okay, this is a God-inspired song that God wants people to sing because it helps them express something within them. It says this, "O Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I struggle with anguish in my soul, with sorrow in my heart every day?" God puts that stuff in his word so that we understand when you feel that way, you just vent at God. And you get it out of your system and you draw closer to God. And in that connection, something happens. Maybe this is why God doesn't give us easy answers. But we do, of course, have another question, which is, but why is there suffering in the world anyway? Why did God make a world with suffering in it when he didn't have to? This is a big question. It's a massive question. And if you kind of go on online forums about people arguing about whether God is real or not, this is one of the things they ask about. And there's a couple of bad arguments that I just want to think about. So one is kind of from a non-Christian perspective. And this was first posited by, at least first written down that we're of, by a Greek philosopher called Epicurus, about 200-300 years before Jesus. And his basic argument was this: God, maybe he is not all-powerful, and he cannot stop suffering. Maybe the reason there is suffering in the world is because God is not strong enough to stop it. And if God is not strong enough to stop suffering, then God is not God at all. Maybe that's not the issue. Maybe God isn't loving. Because if God was loving, he would stop suffering. But we see suffering. Therefore, God is not loving. And people have put out that challenge again and again to Christians. And they say, which one is it? Is it that God isn't strong enough to stop suffering? Or is it that he doesn't love us enough to stop suffering? Go on, which is it? And that sounds like a tough question to answer. I'm going to try and give you an answer to it in a minute. Bear in mind, I've said this is not about getting answers, but it can be helpful to think these things through. But this is a philosopher's argument that says God cannot exist. The Christian bad argument, which sometimes people respond with, which I really, really hate, is it's Adam and Eve. It's all their fault. It's the fault of Adam. It's not, don't blame God for the suffering in the world. Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. The earth is corrupted. Through that corruption comes suffering. Therefore, you can't blame God. Now, I can see where they're coming from. But let's just go back one step. God made Adam and Eve. And he made them with free will. He made them with the ability to be tempted by the enemy. He made an angel called Lucifer with the ability to fall and become the enemy. Now, if God didn't allow that rebellion of Lucifer, none of this would have happened. If God did not give Adam and Eve the ability to be tempted, none of this would have happened. Now, Adam and Eve are told, if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, well, chaos, death will enter the world. So don't do it. So hang on a second, God. So if you'd put a fence round it, none of this would have happened. Because your argument about it's all Adam and Eve's fault, well, didn't God have a responsibility to put a fence round it? If that was going to cause all the suffering of the world, I can't see we can blame it all on Adam and Eve. Because given the situation they were put in, you have to say that God is at least partly, if not fully responsible for what they ended up doing. So you hear Christians use that argument, but I don't think it's a very good argument. So let me try and explain why I think maybe God allows suffering in the world. And it firstly boils down to free will. Free will. We have the ability to make choices that matter. Because maybe free will is more important to a loving God than temporary difficulties. You see, the bad argument of the philosopher that I gave you is, if God does not stop suffering, that means he does not love you. But maybe God does love you and recognizes that your temporary suffering is not as bad as the benefits you gain from having free will. Now, why does having free will mean there is going to be suffering? Well, let's think about it. If you've got free will, there must be a choice between good and bad. If my free will, it's, am I going to have a Mars bar or a Snickers today? All right, if that's the extent of my free will, what kind of free will choice is that? If I have no choice to do something bad, it doesn't matter. Will I steal from that person or not? Will I lie or not? Well, if stealing has no consequences, if every time somebody steals says, oh no, that person's left, I will replace, God replaces the thing they've done. The thing that's been stolen, God replaces, so that they don't have to suffer. Oh, well, all right then. I'll steal from them as well. Oh, God's replaced. I might as well go around stealing from everybody. Because if I steal to avoid suffering, God replaces the thing that I stole. Therefore, I can steal as much as I like. I can get as drunk as I like. I could drink to the point of alcohol poisoning, because when I start to feel bad, or in the morning when I wake up and I've got a hangover, God just removes my suffering. So there's no hangover anymore. Or I don't do stupid things when I'm drunk. You have a choice about whether to overindulge in any substance or not. But it has to have consequences. If God made a world where your consequences did not matter, then where is your free will? Because nothing matters if there is no consequence. Our decisions should matter. Our taking responsibility should matter. So God has to make certain that we're in a world where our choices have consequences. And that means there must be space for suffering. So that's the first part of my thinking. The second part is this. A world with no suffering is a world with no comfort. Because you comfort people when they are suffering. I'm not saying a world, maybe I've just realized I worded that badly. I'm not saying you're not comfortable in a world without suffering. You can be very comfortable in a world without suffering. But that experience of being comforted cannot exist if there is no suffering. Sympathy cannot exist if there is no suffering. Supporting someone cannot exist if there is no suffering. So I think what God did and said, a loving God wants people to be able to experience comfort and sympathy and support. And if there were a world with no suffering, that would be completely missing from our experience. Maybe that's why a loving God can still allow suffering in the world. Now, whatever the cause of suffering, we can have comfort, sympathy, and support. It's worth just briefly remembering, suffering can be our bad choices. Suffering can come when other people make a bad choice that affects us. Suffering can come from the enemy. Suffering can come as a test from God. And I'm not going to get into this now, but I've preached before. Bear in mind, a test from God is not so that God learns about us, because God already knows. A test from God is so that we learn more about ourselves. Okay, that's the purpose of a test from God. We don't know how we're going to react until we're put in a test situation. God already knows, so the test from God is really about our learning. Suffering can be caused by the circumstances we find ourselves in, or even random events. Okay, when it rains heavily, there's going to be a flood somewhere. Okay, it's just random. It's not a sign that some people have been evil, bad, horrible sinners, so God sent a flood. So God makes a world where all these types of cause of suffering are possible. But whatever the cause, it means that we can experience comfort, sympathy, support, and that sort of thing. Which brings us to the third thing, is God's help. We would never experience the help of God if there was nothing for him to help us from. His nature is that of a father who rescues. And we could never experience that if we lived in a world where there was nothing to be rescued from. Romans 8:28. We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. So God has the ability to make everything work out in the end. But if everything is going to work out in the end regardless, because there's no such thing as suffering, you could never experience that. So, in the time of suffering, we experience God's love. God strengthens us, teaches us, we mature. God gives us grace, wisdom, kindness, all of those things, which if we lived in a world with no suffering, we would not experience. I do, however, want to make it absolutely plain, God does not cause problems just so he can help us. Okay? There's this fireman syndrome thing. There is an incredibly high percentage of arsonists, let me rephrase that, not incredibly high percentage. If you look at the general population and you were to think what type of person is most likely to be an arsonist, Who would you think is one of the most likely people to be an arsonist? And the answer is firemen. A larger percentage than you would expect of arsonists are firemen because they like to set a fire so that they can then go along and be a hero and put it out. Okay, so we've got lots of stats in America about this. There have been lots of serial arsonists who are firemen. Okay, they cause a problem so that they can help. Right? God's not like that. I just want to make it absolutely clear. God isn't saying, I want to rescue you from something. Oh, I'm going to give you a really horrible problem so that now I can rescue you. No. Remember, it was the enemy who caused all of Job's problems, and God rescued from that problem. The thing we looked at before about bad choices, random events, there's loads of causes of those problems. Don't go away thinking God's deliberately doing something horrible just so he can look like a hero. Okay, last thing about this is our help for others. In a world with no suffering, we would have no opportunity to help anybody because nobody would need any help. So suffering is not just about what we do when we are suffering, it's how we respond when we see somebody else suffering. And God wanted there to be a world where you can say, that person is suffering, I choose to help them. Or you can use your free will and say, that person's suffering, but I don't care. I'm just going to leave them to it. That's your free will choice. And God wants you to be in a position where you have to think, if nobody else helps them, what's going to happen? Do they need help? What am I going to do? How am I going to respond? Am I going to act like God would, or am I going to act like the enemy would? Our ability to help others comes out of the fact that there is suffering in the world. So, I'm not saying this is definitely right. I'm saying that based on my understanding, my thought processes, I reckon this might be why God allows a world of suffering. Last point of the whole series before we get to a summary is this. Life is not fair. If you've ever felt yourself saying or thinking, this isn't fair, you're right. It isn't. The fact that God is a just God leads us to believe that things should be fair. That's why we get so angry when things are not fair. Scientists who believe in evolution and stuff like that, when they say life isn't fair, you say, well, of course it isn't. Based on your beliefs, there's no such thing as fairness. There's just survival of the fittest, which is the least fair thing you could possibly imagine. But if you've got an inherent belief in justice and God and higher power, then you're going to start saying, with meaning, life isn't fair. And you're right, it isn't. But can I add, from our perspective, life isn't fair. A supernova is when a star basically explodes. It gets to a certain point in its life cycle when it goes boom and it emits vast amounts of light and other energy. And it shines and can be seen from an incredible distance away. So, Raf, I'm not picking on you because you happen to be an astrophysicist, but if you wouldn't mind just standing up for me, I want you to imagine that a star where Raf is has just gone supernova, boom, okay? And Caroline, would you mind standing up for me? And I want you to imagine that Caroline is standing on planet Earth. Actually, you don't have to imagine that because she is standing on planet Earth. So, that's good. But the distance between them, let's imagine that is 1,000 light years. 1,000 light years, that means that traveling at the speed of light, 300 million meters per second, it will take 1,000 years for the light to get from where Raf is over to where Caroline is. So the light sets off. Has Caroline seen it yet? No. But has the event happened? Yes. So the event, the supernova has happened. The light is on its way. There is nothing going to stop that light reaching there. Does Caroline have any evidence that the light is on its way? No. So the light's traveling along. Now I'm standing on a planet halfway between, okay? So it takes 500 years for the light to get from the supernova Raf over to me. I now am aware, from my perspective, There is a supernova in the sky. The light has arrived. It's lighting everything up. Has Caroline seen it yet? No, because the light has not yet reached her. But in another 500 years' time, the light arrives, and the perspective of Caroline changes, because she discovered that 1,000 years ago, the light started traveling. Thank you very much. Could you sit down, please? Perspective is incredibly important. Life, as we know it, as we live it, is not fair. But everything is fair in the end. When all the light has finally reached us, then everything is fair. And the Bible talks about this time. There will be a time when there is no more sickness. We all suffer sickness from time to time. But there will come a time when nobody will ever get sick again. There will be no more death. I'm going to be talking about death next week as it happens. But there's going to come a time when there is no more death, where every wrong deed will be punished or paid for. Every person that you think got away with something, they haven't. Nobody gets away with anything. The day will come when it will be punished or paid for. Every dark secret will be exposed and dealt with. And you wonder about all of these things that are going on behind the scenes, and you wonder what's happening. And one day, every bit of those dark secrets will be exposed and dealt with. There will be a day where creation is restored, and those random events that affect us and cause suffering will not happen ever again. And every single wrong will be made right. In the end, anything that we point to and said, that wasn't fair, God will make certain that it gets made into something that was fair. And there will be no more suffering at all. Now, that's important to remember. When we go through our temporary suffering on this earth, which lasts for a period of time, and it seems all-consuming, and we're feeling the pain, whether it's physical pain, or the mental pain, or the emotional pain, or the anxiety or the worry of not having what we need. All of that is suffering. But it is always temporary. But there is a future where everything is put right. And maybe the point of a loving God, where they say, how could a loving God allow suffering? The point is, maybe God will allow temporary suffering for a greater good. But in the end, it will be put right. And we will see that life wasn't fair, but God was always fair. So, just to sum up, from this series, a few things I want to say. This is a difficult subject. I am not claiming in these 3 sermons to have said everything there is, to have answered every question, and I'm happy to talk. If anybody's got further questions or wants to know how to apply it to themselves, you know what I say, come and talk. We do not get easy answers. I'm not trivializing any suffering that anybody goes through, because suffering is not trivial. There's no easy answers, but our struggles can bring us to God. God doesn't pretend suffering doesn't happen. He knows that there is suffering and that it happens. God doesn't pretend that it's easy. The stuff in the Bible demonstrates that he knows it is difficult. It is hard to go through suffering. But we have the promise that God makes everything work for good. As part of that, he supports and we support. So within suffering, we look at that and think this is a moment where I can receive support, but also we can see others who suffer and give support. And by the way, the two are not mutually exclusive. It's not, I'm suffering, so I can't help anybody. When I stop suffering, then I'll be able to help. It's not that. Even in our suffering, we can help others. But eventually, everything will be put right. That's the message of this series.